Well, good evening and welcome to the first virtual Cabinet meeting by virtue of the Local Authorities and Police and Crime Panel's Coronavirus Flexibility of Local Authority Police and Crime Panel Meetings England and Wales Regulations 2020. The regulations have temporarily removed the legal requirement for local authorities to hold public meetings in person during the coronavirus pandemic. Meetings will remain accessible whilst ensuring that councillors, staff and the wider public are able to follow government advice by staying at home to stop the spread of coronavirus. The requirement for public meetings to be made accessible to the public remains, and the link to the virtual meeting is available on the council's website in the usual live meeting link page. If a connection to a member is lost during this meeting, I will stop the meeting to enable the connection to be restored. If the connection cannot be restored within a reasonable time, the meeting will proceed, but the member who was disconnected will not be able to vote on the matter under discussion as they would not have heard all of the facts in the presentation. Should any aspect of the external link fail, I may call a short adjournment of up to 5 minutes or so to determine whether the connection can quickly be re-established. If the connection is not restored within that time, the meeting will be adjourned and any further business will not proceed until another time and date. Any questions submitted to Cabinet during this period within the submission deadline will be read out by myself and answered at the meeting. So this is our first Cabinet meeting, which we're now holding online for all of the reasons that are set out. Cabinet are currently staying at home so that we can protect the NHS and save lives, and we are working remotely as part of the new rules that have been relaxed to allow us to do so. I just want to say, whilst we're broadcasting live, this is the first Cabinet meeting since we have entered the period of lockdown following the coronavirus outbreak, and I just want to pay tribute to all of the key workers, all of the NHS staff, all of the volunteers and all of the communities of Oldham who have come together to support the relief effort and make sure that our most vulnerable in our communities are still getting the support that they need. I was at the food bank this morning helping to deliver emergency food parcels, and I know that many other councillors from across Oldham have also been doing the same, but it was also great to see many people from all different parts of the borough and communities who are also either pulling together emergency food, delivering emergency food parcels themselves, donating goods and items and things to be distributed to those in need. It was a really great example of the way that people have pulled together in really difficult times. So that included many people, of course, who have been furloughed, and whilst they couldn't take the opportunity to have a break from work, they are using the time to put back in and support those who are less fortunate. Thank you, of course, to all of the staff at the council. The infrastructure that has been implemented in order to support the coronavirus relief effort was brought in a matter of days, and it was absolutely incredible how quickly that was up and running and how quickly we could start supporting people. So my thanks on record to them also. I think the first thing that I need to do, because this is a slightly different way of doing things, is to invite the Cabinet members to introduce themselves so that people out there who are watching this live video link know who is on the call. So this is in no particular order. Can I ask the relevant Cabinet member, I'll do a roll call, to unmute and then mute yourself again once you've said that you're here. Councillor O'Rayman, can you confirm that you're present?
Present.
Councillor Chatterton?
Present.
Councillor Chowan?
Present.
Councillor Shah? Councillor Shah?
Present.
Thank you. Councillor Mushtaq?
Present.
Councillor Jabbar? Councillor Jabbar?
Yes, I'm present.
Yeah, you're here. Thank you. Councillor Roberts?
Present.
Wonderful, thank you. Also on the call we have the Chief Executive, Dr. Carolyn Wilkins, Deputy Chief Executive Helen Lockwood, Director of Finance Anne Ryans, Director of Legal Paul Entwistle, Liz Drogan from Constitutional Services, Rebecca Sutcliffe, Director of Reform, Emma Barton, Director of Economy, Gerard Jones, Managing Director Children's. I think I've got everybody's title right, but the names are important anyway, and you'll be hearing from one of those later on in the agenda. So moving on to the next agenda item. Item 2 is urgent business. I have been notified of one item of urgent business, which is will be considered under item 10, which is the proposed purchase of former WH Shaw Pallet Works, Huddersfield Road, Diggle, and that will take place in Part B of the meeting. So that is the only item of urgent business. Item 3, declarations of interest. Ask members to indicate to me if they need to come in and declare any interests that are relevant. Nobody has indicated, so there are no relevant interests to be declared at this meeting. Item 4 is the minutes of the Cabinet meeting held on the 23rd of March 2020. We're going to have to do the roll call again so that people know that these have been agreed. In the same order as last time, can you indicate if you agree with these minutes as a correct record? Councillor Chowan, you're at the top of my list at the moment.
Agreed.
Councillor O'Rayman.
Agreed.
Councillor Chatterton.
Agreed.
Councillor Shah.
Agreed.
Councillor Mushtaq.
Agreed.
Councillor Jabbar.
Agreed.
And Councillor Roberts.
Agreed.
Fantastic, and I agree as well. So those minutes are agreed as a correct record. Item 5 is public question time. We have not received any public questions, so we can move on to item 6, which is resources received by the Council in response to COVID-19 and the creation of a council fund for related expenditure to supplement the government's announced funding. Councillor Jabbar, could I ask you to introduce this item and then call on any officers as necessary?
Thank you, Chair. So, as you said, this report is about the amount of resources that we received from central government to do with the outbreak of coronavirus. There are a number of grants. I'm going to leave the detail to our Borough Treasurer Anne Ryans to pick up, except just to say that we obviously welcome the support that's been given to benefit the resident and businesses in Oldham. And I'm going to ask Anne to take you through the full report. And if you could please come in and take us through the report, please.
Oops.
Yes, thank you very much. I will say in presenting the paper that it's unusual to bring a financial report so early in the year, but it's currently, obviously, we're facing very unusual and challenging times. So it is important to highlight the range of resources that we have received at the end of the 1920 financial year and also in the early part of 2021, most of which relate to COVID-19. So towards the very end of the financial year 1920, we received a number of grants totaling £1.9 million. And most of those, of the 1.9 million, all of that is for use in 1920. They were notified after the last report to Cabinet on the that was presented on the 23rd of March, so couldn't previously be reported to members. All of those will be incorporated within the 1920 Statement of Accounts. So in relation to the number of significant grants that we've received around COVID-19, the first one was an unring-fenced grant payment of £7.6 million, and that was received at the end of March. It was the council's share of a £1.6 billion unring-fenced grant allocation that the government made to local government. The government has indicated that this is to meet the additional costs associated with COVID-19, but particularly highlighted its use for spending on adult social care, although it can be used for any purpose. It is the first tranche of funding that we'll be receiving, as on April the 18th, the government notified of a further £1.6 billion local government allocation. However, we've not yet been notified of our share, but we anticipate it might be similar to the first tranche of £7.6 million. Secondly, the council received £11.2 million of grant in lieu of business rates at the very end of March, and this was received to support cash flow. This grant has actually been anticipated and included within the 2021 budget, but was paid early given the government's recognition of the significant drain on council resources towards as the coronavirus COVID-19 impacts were coming forward. This will be carried forward into 2021 and will be used to support the budget as initially intended. The third significant grant was £54.7 million that was received on the 1st of April. And this is a grant that has been allocated to the Council to administer the government's business grants initiative. And at this point in time, the Council is working through the payment of those business grants. And the final grant received on the 3rd of April was a £3 million, just over £3 million hardship fund. And the next item on the agenda goes into that in more detail, so I won't elaborate on that at this point. Also in March, one further grant was notified to the Council, which we will be receiving in 2021. And that was the 2021 Public Health Grant notification. That was notified at just over £17 million, which is £600,000 more than was initially anticipated in the budget report approved in February. And those resources will increase the net revenue budget of the Council and be ring-fenced to public health services. It's important to note that that notification was over 2 months later than we'd anticipated it. So clearly, the additional resources will now be taken into the budget. The final element of the report advises that £2.4 million of the Council's reserves have been identified to provide additional support for costs associated with COVID-19. So when this is added to the £7.6 million of unring-fenced government resources, it will enables the Council to have as a priority and to have some flexibility to deploy £10 million of resources to meet urgent and unforeseen costs. So the financial monitoring reports that will come forward to Cabinet during the financial year 2021 will include updates in relation to the use of all the resources that I've just outlined, and clearly will reflect the financial challenge that the Council will be facing as a result of COVID-19. So I'm happy to take any questions if members have any.
Thanks, Anne, for taking us through that report. I've heard from Councillor Roberts that she wishes to come in on this item. Councillor Roberts.
Thank you, Councillor Fielding. I just wanted to add my thanks and to the comments that you made at the beginning of the meeting, particularly around the work that's been done by the housing team. There's been a lot of work in a very short space of time. We've moved many people who are in temporary accommodation into accommodation which is suitable in the current circumstances. So that's fully self-contained accommodation, and that's obviously required finding and as well as moving people, so finding the accommodation. We've also managed to move the people who are receiving our bed for every night services as part of the tackling homelessness initiative, tackling rough sleeping initiative from the Mayor of Greater Manchester. A provision that we had previously was a dormitory, and we've now managed to move people into self-contained accommodation, which is much more appropriate in the current circumstances. The Housing Option Service remains open and is continuing to receive applications for rehousing and for homelessness applications. There continues to be a steady flow of applications. This is all being done by phone, and we have had more than usual, although not a huge number more, of cases arising from issues around domestic violence, which is something that we're keeping an eye on and is clearly a cause for concern. And just like to add as well that the planning service is continuing again to receive applications, again as online applications only, and officers are continuing to work to process the applications that we've received. But I'd just like to add my thanks to yours, to all of the staff who worked very hard at very short notice to make all of this happen. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Roberts. It is incredible, again, the work that has been done on supporting rough sleepers and the homeless and those who access the Bed Every Night scheme. One of my colleagues down in Failsworth works very closely with the Bed Every Night provision through his involvement with Street Angels, and occasionally I've joined him to see what happens there. And it was clear that the dormitory provision was not going to be suitable with the social distancing restrictions that were brought in. And so how quickly that was turned around and delivered to ensure that those people can remain safe and prevent themselves from being at any greater risk of infection from COVID-19 than anybody else. The rate at which that was turned around was really, really impressive. I just wanted to make reference to the business grants which Anne referred to as having received more than £50 million from the government to distribute to businesses in receipt of small business rates relief and hospitality businesses and leisure businesses, amongst others. When the league table was published to show how much money had been paid out by the council of the grants that it was administering, I was quite pleased to see that we compare very favourably with other local authorities around the country, our near neighbours and neighbours from farther afield too. That's an example of where when staff cannot continue to do the jobs that they would normally have done had we not been in this situation, they've been redeployed to support a team to pay out those business grants in order to process them as quickly as possible so that we can support as many businesses as quickly as possible and ensure that they have financial stability and can come out the other side of this and still operate as a business and go on to continue to be successful, hopefully, and rebuild the economy. I was featured in the local press recently, having written to Boris Johnson. It was part of a coordinated national campaign of Labour council leaders to call for the government to make good on its pledge to reimburse councils the funding that they had to spend to respond to the COVID-19 relief effort, and also to reimburse councils for the income that many of us have lost as a result of COVID-19 too. We have made a calculation here in Oldham that it could be in excess of £46 million that it cost the council to respond to COVID-19 or due to lost income because of COVID-19. You know, for example, we have suspended parking charges on our own car parks, but had we not done that, it is unlikely that we'll get much income anyway because people are not going out as much. And so that's one example of where we would lose income. Another example is planning fees, of course. Many fewer people are undertaking building work and do not require planning permission in the same numbers that they would have done had this pandemic not happened, and so we are losing income from planning. We're also facing increased expenditure in adult social care and other services across the council as a result of having to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic, and that all comes to, as I've said, £46.2 million at the worst case. Now, up until last weekend, we had received £7.6 million, which was partial reimbursement for some of that funding. And then following the letters that were sent by Labour council leaders, another announcement was made later that day of the 1.6 billion that Anne referred to. If that happens in the same way, if that is distributed in the same way as the previous 1.6 billion, we'll get another 7.6. But that would take us to 15.2 and still leave us £31 million adrift of where we could be in terms of lost income. And so we really need to keep up the pressure on the government. They told us to spend whatever was necessary in order to respond to the coronavirus pandemic, and we have done exactly that because we have a duty to our communities. But we cannot, after 10 years of sustained austerity, and after 10 years which has seen over £210 million cut from our overall budget, then stand any proportion of those losses or of that increased expenditure ourselves. We must be fully reimbursed for the money that we are spending to support the most vulnerable and to support businesses here in Oldham. So with that, I'll bring in Councillor Jabbar, who I think wants to make some closing remarks on this item. Councillor Jabbar.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So, yeah, just going back to the business rates, I think, as you acknowledge, we've done fantastically well in Oldham to get the money out to businesses. And I just want to take this opportunity to thank all the staff. Some of them worked over the holiday periods and weekend to make the payment to our businesses. Just going back to the letter that you wrote, the Chair, I think it's really important that government said that they would refund us for the expenditure that we incur in relation to the outbreak of the coronavirus. And I'm hearing a slightly different tone now, where the housing minister is talking about the local authorities should bear a fair share of that cost. Well, as you just said, we lost £216 million from our budget over the last 10 years or so through austerity. So we've got no additional resources to be able to contribute to this. So I'm again supporting what you said in your letter, which is that the government should fully fund the costs that we incur in relation to COVID-19. Just going back to some of the areas that you covered, so as well as car parking planning, we're also losing quite a lot of income from trade waste collection, from catering and the registrar's fees, as well as other fees as well. And the expenditure on adult social care is quite significant. So we need to make sure that we continue that lobby. We've done it on top of all this expenditure and low income. There will also be added pressure on the council. So the initial assessment that the council has done shows that the unemployment in Oldham will increase from 4% to 19%, by the end of next month. Clearly, that will have an impact in the borough, and I'm sure it will have impact on the council in terms of additional support services that we'll need to provide. And as well as that, Chair, immediately what we've got is a situation where the number of individuals and businesses who actually don't qualify for the financial assistance that the government have announced through the various various schemes, financial assistance schemes. So we will need to find some way of supporting them. So to conclude then, Chair, that yes, we welcome the additional resources that's been given to the council, and we are spending them as per instruction of the government. But the issue remains that we need to be funded fully for the expenditure and the lost income that we have as a result of COVID-19. And the recommendation of the report is on page 3 of this report. So if anybody wants to have a quick look at that before the vote, then they're listed on page 3 of the report. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Councillor Jabbar. I think you've summed up the item well enough, and so I think it's sensible to move to the vote. There were no questions in that. I know that lots of members just wanted to make points about things contained in the report that didn't require addressing, but I'm grateful to those members for their contributions. I will now run through the list of members on the line to seek their agreement, again in no particular order. Councillor Arayman.
Agreed.
Councillor Chatterton.
Agreed.
Councillor Mushtaq.
Agreed.
Councillor Jabbar.
Agreed.
Councillor Roberts.
Agreed.
Councillor Chauhan.
Agreed.
Councillor Shah.
Agreed.
Right, thank you everybody, and agreed from me as well. So we can move on to item 7 now. That is hardship funding 2020-21. Again, Councillor Jabbar, could I ask you to present and bring in any officers as necessary?
Yes, thank you, Chair. So as was mentioned in the previous item, we received an additional funding for an hardship just over £3 million. So in essence, basically what we're saying is that the government is giving us £3 million to set up additional support for people who are in receipt of council tax reduction. But this is for working age people. Again, Chair, if I could ask our Borough Treasurer, Anne Ryans, to take us through the detail.
Yes, thank you, I will. So, as you've indicated, the report sets out
is now joining.
The report sets out the proposed use of the £3,015,000 hardship grant funding received from central government. This is the council's share of £500 million of new funding that the government announced to support economically vulnerable people and households. The government's intention is that the funding will be used to support council tax reduction working age claimants with an award of £150 into their council tax accounts. Now, this would normally be administered through the council tax reduction scheme, but once we have set the council tax reduction scheme, which we did at the Budget Council in February, it can't be amended. Therefore, the council will award the £150 using discretionary powers under section 13A1C of the Local Government Finance Act 1992. So based on the number of working age council tax reduction recipients, and also taking into account that given the current circumstances, there are likely to be more recipients as we go through the year, and an assumption of an increase of 25% due to the impact of COVID-19. It's anticipated that that cohort of people will use £2.7 million of the funding that's available. So clearly there will be some resources left over. It's proposed that the remaining grant funding will be used firstly to ensure that council tax claimants are not council tax reduction claimants are not detrimentally impacted by a change in housing benefit earning disregard regulations, where housing benefit recipients are entitled to working tax credit. As part of the government's response to coronavirus, it introduced changes to housing benefit regulations. Without support, however, those in receipt of housing benefit impacted by working tax credit changes would be no better off. And this is because their housing benefit would increase, but they would be entitled, or they would be required, I should say, to pay an increased council tax. So in order to provide support for that group, it's proposed that there will be support funded through, again, the Section 13A regulations, and we will use the council's exceptional hardship payments to ensure that working tax credit earnings disregard means that nobody's financially disadvantaged. It's anticipated that will cost around about £300,000, given the numbers that fall into that group. There will then be an anticipated balance of funding. The precise sum obviously can't be determined at this point, but it's intended that balance will be used to support a temporary amendment to the council's local welfare provision scheme, so that any applications can be considered with regard to exceptional circumstances where there is an immediate need from extremely vulnerable households who may not be in receipt of means tested benefits. So the object of the exercise will be to contain the awards within the total grant sum, but that will be monitored as we go through the financial year. So happy to take any questions on the report.
Apologies. Councillor Shah, I've got Councillor Shah indicating.
Thank you, Chair.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to extend my thanks to Councillor Jabbar as well for the work, and to his team, including Anne Ryans, who have allocated this hardship fund to the most vulnerable. But just to pick up on your earlier points, Chair, as well, and Councillor Roberts had mentioned earlier about the work that the Planning Department have done, but equally, I think what's really visible in all this and really important for us to recognise is that every time something happens, and our natural instinct is that when difficulty arises, how can we help and what can we do? And local government always does that. But actually, with the establishment of the community hubs that have also been a lifeline for the most vulnerable of our residents, we've seen that we've adapted so quickly, and our operating model has not just changed once, but in some occasions, especially with the community hubs, 2 or 3 times, just to respond to government guidelines or Public Health England guidelines. And I think it's important, we've recognised now that through this pandemic, that the most people that were most undervalued in our societies, the NHS, our frontline services, all these people are the ones that have stepped up, including local government and our voluntary sector. And I think it's important for us as local politicians to recognise this and hold the government to account, because if they're not going to value our frontline services now, if they're not going to value local government, and we're really blessed in Oldham with a really exceptional, talented team with Dr. Carolyn Wilkins and all her executive management team who've adapted and responded just the way that we would like them to, and in Oldham's way, which is to make sure that our most vulnerable residents are protected. But if they're not going to value local government now, the public sector or our voluntary sector, then I don't think they ever will. And I think it's really important to put that on record, that it's okay, we'll step up because that's what we do and that's what we like to serve in that way. But actually government have to do more than just make announcements and actually recognise the work we do by making sure that they fund us appropriately. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Sharon. I'd certainly endorse all of those comments. I think one observation I'd like to make on the report is that it's absolutely the right decision to be able to reimburse those normally eligible for council tax reduction, so that they do not have to worry about paying council tax at all this year. And I welcome the government's decision to provide us with the funding to make it possible for us to do that. It was regrettable, of course, when the government not so many years ago took the decision to devolve council tax reduction to local councils, but not just devolve it. Of course, I would normally be calling for devolution in other forums, but not just devolve it, but also cut the budget that we had to sustain that provision for the less well-off in Oldham. And so what that meant is that for the first time, many of our less well-off residents were having to pay a council tax bill that previously they had never had to worry about before. I hope that the government learns from this experience of providing that funding, and it can be made a permanent fixture so that we no longer have to burden some of our least well-off residents with paying that small proportion of council tax, which can be the difference between having a good amount of money to live on or not so much. Councillor Jabbar, please, you have indicated that you want to come back.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And I think just like to echo what Councillor Shah said earlier about the work that the Community Hub has done in particular in setting up the structure for delivering food and medicine and other essential items to people who've been self-isolating and also people who are vulnerable. So can I take this opportunity to thank her and Rebecca and the team for doing that work, and the many volunteers who've come forward to help the vulnerable residents. So thank you very much for that. Just in terms of this report, Chair, I echo what you said, but can I just, for clarity, go through what's happening in respect of council tax, certainly in Oldham. So obviously, you heard about the additional relief that's available to people of working age who are going to be receiving council tax reduction. So anyone who is not able to pay council tax and struggling, then they can apply for the council tax reduction. On top of that, what we've done in Oldham is announced a 3-month council tax holiday. So if you're not able to pay but don't want to claim for council tax reduction, you're able to stagger your payment over a 9-month period starting from 1st of July and not pay for the first 3 months of the financial year, i.e. April, May, June. And if you want to do that, then you need to contact the council tax department and we will reschedule your payments. I think what's quite important is well, Chair, that we've been receiving a lot of comments on Facebook and Twitter and so on about why isn't the council giving people 50% reduction in council tax. Well, the reason they make comparison to the business rate holiday that's been given to retail, hospitality and leisure sectors for the full financial year. Well, the reason for that is council tax is highly regulated, and at a local level we don't have any, once the council tax is set, we don't have any discretion whatsoever to change the amount of council tax that is being charged to individuals. So, if the government were to today say, well, people can have 3 months holiday for their council tax, then we could implement that. But as a council, we can unilaterally do that. And council tax, as the Borough Treasurer has mentioned earlier, is highly regulated, and we have very little discretion at all. So with that, I'm happy to move the recommendation, Chair, of this report.
Thanks, Councillor Jabbar, and thanks for that clarification about who is eligible, but also the clarification around the calls for a reduction in council tax for everybody. I do think that the majority of people out there do realise that it is important to continue paying council tax because of the pressure that is on council services generally and how necessary council services are to so many people right out there in the borough. But it's particularly important at the moment for all of the reasons that we discussed earlier on in the meeting around the loss of income for the council during this period and the increase in expenditure. Now, even if it were not for the legal reasons why we cannot provide the 50% reduction that a small number of people are calling for, I think that the majority of people do realise that it is important to pay council tax and that public services do need to be appropriately funded. Of course, I would support a reduction for people if the government were to announce the funding to enable us to do that and to enable a change in the rules. Of course, the last time the national government stepped in to provide funding for a reduction in council tax for residents was when Gordon Brown in 2005 gave a £200 council tax rebate to all pensioners back then. So the last time that happened was 2005 under the Labour government of Tony Blair, when Gordon Brown was the Chancellor. And so maybe if things were different, that might be happening today, but we'll just have to wait and see whether the current government is so generous as to offer that money to councils and enable us to do that. Councillor Jabbar has moved the recommendation, so it's now the roll call of members present to ask if they agree with that recommendation. Councillor Mushtaq?
Agreed.
Councillor Chatterton?
Agreed.
Councillor O'Rayman?
Agreed.
Councillor Jabbar?
Agreed.
Councillor Roberts?
Agreed.
And Councillor Chowan?
Agreed.
Councillor Shah?
Agreed.
And I agree as well. So that item is agreed. So now we move to item 8, which is the exclusion of the press and public. So as with the ordinary cabinet meetings, once the exclusion of the press and public has been moved at the meeting to enable cabinet to discuss commercially sensitive reports, the press and public will no longer be able to view the meeting, and that means that the live link will stop. So thank you to all those out there watching. I'm now going to end the live link as we move into part B of this meeting.